Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today on what is always one of the busiest days of the calendar year here in the Capitol, and particularly in the education community. Earlier today, Governor Newsom presented his May revision budget proposal, which introduced more new and different programs than just about any education budget in recent memory. At the same time, it neglected to address a lot of the long-standing financial issues that impact school stability and viability in the upcoming years. So we're going to explore the tension between those two elements, and it will provide a lot of rich information. Before we get into those details, we are going to take care of a few housekeeping matters so everybody can participate in today's webinar. There will be a question and answer segment at the end of the panelist presentations. So please reserve your questions until the end, but you can submit them now so we'll be able to ask them after all the panelists have provided the information they have to share. In order to submit your questions now, go over to the panel, which for most of you will be on the right-hand side of your screen. There you will see several gray menu bars. Toward the bottom of that list is one titled Questions. Right before the word question, there is an arrow pointing to the right. If you click on that arrow so it's facing downward, this will cause a text box to open. Type your question into the box just like you would for an email or a text message, hit send. CSBA staff will receive that message behind the scenes, and we will try to get to as many questions as we can at the end of the webinar. We won't get to all of them given the number of registrants, but we will select a representative sample so you can get information on a wide range of topics. And the people who will be providing that information are here today, and it is a very esteemed panel of guests. We're glad to have them with us. We have Michael Fine, Chief Executive of FCMAT, a statewide agency which provides financial assistance, information, and support to local education agencies. We are also offering a local perspective. Brett McFadden is a superintendent in the Nevada Joint Union High School District, and Dr. Daryl Camp is a superintendent in San Lorenzo, USD. Of course, we have our CEO and Executive Director, Vernon M. Billy, and also CSBA's Assistant Executive Director for Governmental Relations, Dennis Meyers. We also have two of our advocates here today, Erika Hoffman and Cheryl Ed.D. I'm Troy Flint, Chief Information Officer, and I will be moderating today's event. But before we get into our analysis, we'd like to hear a response to the governor's May revised budget from CEO and Executive Director Vernon M. Billy.
Thank you, Troy, and thank you all for joining us this evening to view our webinar. You know, like most of you, I always eagerly await the May revision. It's an extremely important funding document and equally important policy setting document for the state. This year's May revise offers a lot to digest in that respect. The May revised proposal contains more bright, shiny budget proposals than I think any budget in recent memory. And yet, at the same time, many of our underlying structural funding issues still remain. Governor Newsom's proposal is extremely generous in terms of the amount of money it allocates to K-12 schools and is ambitious in terms of the new programs it establishes. $20 billion for universal pre-K, community schools, mental health, academic interventions, teacher recruitment, college savings accounts, and money for smaller classes is a substantial commitment all the way around. The new programs are well-intentioned and generally address areas of great need. For that, the governor should be commended. At the same time, we continue to have concerns about the creation of new programs with one-time funding that should be used for things like fully paying off deferrals. We saw this pattern with the $6.6 billion that was used to pay for AB 86 in February. And we see it again now, even though the state Prop 98 revenues exceeded projections by more than $17 billion. And even with unexpected revenue, this proposal falls short of the promise contained in current law to increase the guarantee annually through annual supplemental payments, which is extremely important, and we're going to talk more about that in a little bit. The final budget should extend assistance for employer pension contributions past the next fiscal year and pay for nearly $600 million in increased unemployment insurance costs that schools have been asked to shoulder recently. In addition, the final budget could restore $350 million in statewide Prop 98 funding that is inappropriately being reallocated to 5 Bay Area county governments instead of going to public schools statewide. This error is due to an incorrect interpretation of the calculations or by the state controller on the Local Education Revenue Augmentation Fund, or ERAF as it is known. Our panel will discuss this much later in the presentation, and I really encourage you to pay attention to this conversation. It's an important discussion. All of these items represent hundreds of millions of dollars that could be used to support students and address opportunity and achievement gaps in this time of crisis. It's critical that we use this moment as an opportunity to rethink and transform our education system. We have a lot of work to do, and CSBA will continue to work with the administration and the legislature to address these and other issues contained in the budget. So thank you for joining us. And now let's dig into the specifics of the May revise with our team of experts, starting off with Dennis. Dennis, take it away.
Great, thank you, Vernon. Appreciated that introduction because it really frames everything we're going to be talking about and kind of sets an agenda for advocacy over the next few weeks. So go ahead, next slide, please. Let's start off kind of big picture and just look at, overall what Proposition 98 is looking like. So, there's, the current budget, then there's the January budget proposal introduced by the governor, and now the May revision. And there's differences between all three. So just between the January budget and now, there's been an increase in Proposition 98, and that's all reflected in these numbers. So, when we talk about Proposition 98 being $93.7 billion, you always have to remember that's a K-14 number. So we included here the K-12 number as well. So we're just 89% of Proposition 98, and then 11% goes to the community colleges. That's kind of a historic number there. But the difference there between January and now is still pretty significant. For K-12, it's $7 billion. And that's just in the actual budget proposals, because the budget as adopted in the current year assumed a huge reduction in state general fund and Proposition 98 funding. And so that didn't happen. And so that's why we have such big numbers right now, because the big part of the recession never happened here in California, even with jobless numbers down as high as they are and things like that. So what we have here is a difference, between January and now of about $7 billion just on the K-12 side. Proposition 98 remains in Test 1, which, when you're adopting a budget locally, you're not always thinking Test 1. But what that means is that general fund revenues are growing pretty well right now. And so the three tests that are in Proposition 98, the one that produces the most funding is Test 1 right now, and that's basically 38% of the state general fund. So it doesn't matter how fast we're growing or declining. It doesn't matter what inflation is. That is the test that is operative current year, and then as we look forward. And so it's about 38% of the state general fund. Next slide, please. As we look at, kind of what the differences are in cash, and it's, cash, again, when you're talking cash locally, that's one thing. But when we're talking cash, we're kind of looking statewide. And so you're going to hear a lot of the news about $17.7 billion being available. The thing is that this budget, as always, is always looking back a year. It's always looking at the current year. And those are just adjustments then, as they closed out last year, as they're now three quarters of the way through this year, and then projecting that in. And so that's why that number is so high, is because it's the adjustments plus looking forward, and it's still 17.7. And again, then the translation into what that means for K-12 is almost $16 billion. I mean, these are significant funds Probably the biggest, I mean, you're always going to hear the number, these are historic. They are, because if it's $1 more than last year, it's historic. But nonetheless, these are really, really big numbers when we're looking at them here at the state level. Go ahead, next slide, please. A couple of issues that are addressed here. If you have been tracking this since the adoption of the current budget, this back in June of last year, there was a promise, I will say, made in the budget adoption, and that was because there was this assumed drop that was going to happen in Proposition 98. That the wrong slide. I'm on the wrong slide. I'm a slide ahead. What this is here is because the revenues are growing fast, they're outpacing the state's GAN limit. So you've heard a lot about the GAN limit. You all have a GAN limit locally. The state has one too. So it's here we call it the state appropriations limit or the GAN limit. The growth in the budget in current year and next year actually creates the state is actually over its GAN limit by some $16 billion. And the way that GAN limit works is the state can push that money back out to taxpayers half and schools half. And so you'll see in news reports over the weekend about tax rebates that are given to certain income levels, things like that. Well, the other half is this amount of money that's available for allocation to schools. It's not in this budget. It's not in the next budget. The way this is it's kind of a projection into the future. So it's not something that we will see until 2022, 2023, and it will be adjusted as we move closer to that number. So right now, it looks like schools will be eligible for $8.1 billion because of the excess GAN limit. However, that will be adjusted. It could be higher, could be lower. That's not included in any of these numbers, but we're just kind of saying, hey, that's in the future. Let's keep an eye on that because of the excess, how far the state is above its appropriations limit. Next slide, please. Now, something that you are all very well going to be in tune with, because this really is bottom line money that you will be budgeting, and that is what's the cost of living increase, what we call the COLA. So as you recall, the budget that we're in right now included a zero COLA. So now that we're, once we saw where cash was heading 3-4 months ago, we started lobbying saying, wow, you know what, provide a COLA in the current year. So when the January budget was introduced, the January budget included a COLA for this year and then a COLA for next year, called a compound COLA. And so putting those 2 years together, it was a COLA in 21-22 of 3.84%. Again, that's really decent. It was a good number, but a little bit has happened since then, and that is that the current year COLA stayed at 2.31%, but the next year COLA actually increased. And this isn't like an act of benevolence on the part of the state. This is just because the index that is used actually is different because it's more up to date now than it was in January. It went up by 0.2%. So it was 1.5%. It is now 1.7%. So that compounded COLA is now increased as well. So let's kind of go down to the chart there. You can see at the bottom of the page, the governor's budget had the compounded COLA of 3.84%. With the May revision, that COLA for next year has been updated. So the compounded COLA is now 4.05%. Now, here's where there is a difference. I'm not going to say benevolence, but this is a policy fiscal choice from the administration to actually then add to that compounded COLA an additional 1%. So how this is going to work is for special education, compounded COLA. In the January budget, there wasn't a compounded COLA for special education. There will be one now for special education, the compound, so that will be 4.05%. For LCFF funded, it's going to be the compounded COLA plus an additional 1%, which is then going to get you to 5.07%. So again, that's really decent ongoing money for LEAs, and that's important to note because as you're looking through your budgets right now, that's something that you will be plugging in right now as you look into the next the budget you're developing into the budget year, which is 2021, 2022. Next slide, please. So we're always talking about deferrals. You know, if we roll back into the early 2000s when deferrals started to occur, you know, the education community was faced with a choice in a down year when the state would say, well, we've got this mechanism called deferrals. We can cut you or we can fund you at a level, but then defer payments into the next fiscal year. It allows the state in a down year to realize the savings, but it protects local educational agencies to have a kind of an artificially higher level of funding. So as this budget was put together in June of last year, remember, everyone expected the bottom to fall out. This series of $11 billion of deferrals was adopted starting in February and not actually paying those back until November. So as the January budget was introduced, revenues were coming in, the bottom did not fall out. So in January, the governor said, all right, recognizing that things are a lot better than what we had expected and even budgeted for, the January budget proposed paying off almost all of the deferrals. So it proposed to pay off February, March, April, and May, which is great for cash flow purposes. Again, it's because the bottom did not fall out. But then the governor in January then said, but I want to hang on to that June deferral. Back then, it was, we're not exactly sure where the May revision is going to fall. And so there was a little bit of a safety. But since then, we've seen revenues continue to climb. And so now here we are at the May revision, perfect time to pay off all the deferrals. The governor is not proposing to pay off that June deferral. So cash flow wise for you, it's maybe a 3-week period between the June deferral to when you would get paid in July. But it's not really a cash flow issue for us when we're lobbying this at Sacramento. We're saying, wait a minute, deferrals were to protect us in a down year. This is not a down year. So why is that June deferral not being paid? You're going to see every slide after this with new proposed ideas. It's actually because there is money in this budget that is being spent elsewhere, and instead of paying off this June deferral. So this June deferral was actually adopted at $2.375 billion, which is about 71% of the June apportionment. The governor proposes in the May revision to hold on to that and actually increase it to 2.6. So it's about 78% of that June deferral. Again, there's no reason, no cash reason at the state level to keep this deferral in place. So that's going to be a major advocacy point as we walk through the next few weeks at budget adoption. Next slide, please. Now, here's the point I was thinking about earlier. So supplemental payments, as this budget was adopted currently, remember, there was the assumption of a major dip in Proposition 98. The state adopted the budget to say, wow, let's somehow make this up to schools and include what they called a supplemental payment. And it was a certain percentage of the general fund that would be paid back to schools to slowly get the test one dollar amount from 38% to 40%. Great idea. It was meant to be something done over time to get recommitted back to schools to actually increase the Prop 98 share in a test 1 year of the state general fund. And it was worth about $12.5 billion. The January budget, the governor said, wow, you know what? Things aren't as bad as we thought. So he proposed getting rid of the supplemental payment promise to build back to and go to 40% of the state general fund. But then he said, but I'll keep one of these supplemental payments. We'll just make one payment of $2.3 billion. That was January. Now in May, progressing now, things are even better than in January. What the governor's proposing is to even pull back that $2.3 billion supplemental payment. So what they'll say is, well, yeah, but when we get to the transitional kindergarten slide in a couple of slides from now, they'll say, but we're going to be rebenching for this transitional kindergarten proposal. But again, from our perspective at the statewide level, the state is completely rolling back what's in statute right now, which is that promise to get us to 40% of the state general fund. Next slide. Now, a lot of you know that there is a Proposition 98 reserve account. You know, the full title is there at the top. We just call it the Prop 98 reserve. Because revenues are coming in faster than expected, and because there is faster growth in capital gains income, and no money is owed to schools under the Prop 98 guarantee, is what we call maintenance factor, then there's this contribution to the Prop 98 reserve. So the chart there shows that in the governor's budget, there was this expected contribution required over a 2-year period to the Prop 98 reserve of almost $3 billion. Fast forward now to the May revision, and those numbers are actually bigger. So the required contribution to the Prop 98 reserve account is now $4.6 billion. This is money not going out the door to LEAs. It's being parked in a reserve in the state treasury for future use. Now, what this does also is this then triggers the school district reserve cap. For those of you who have been around, you remember that fight that we had when this reserve cap was created. So yes, this does trigger that the reserve cap in the year following this next year. But there's so many caveats here. Is yes, it was put into place, but then we worked to pretty much gets it repealed for everybody. So it does not apply to you if you're a small district, 2,500 kids or less. If you're a basic aid district, doesn't apply to you. And then what we got the legislature to do is rework the definition of which reserves it applies to. So all the school board has to do is commit your funds to the reserves, and the reserve cap doesn't even apply to committed funds. And that's a simple act. You just create these accounts, the board adopts them, therefore they are committed. And so, you know, work with your fiscal staff so that you could make sure that your reserves that you do hold on to don't get impacted by this reserve cap. So, you know, we got all of that changed in a couple of years ago, but again, it does trigger it, but there are obviously you know, ways to where it should not apply to anybody. Next slide, please. So next is going to be Cheryl Ed.D, our budget lobbyist, one of our budget lobbyists, but she's our primary budget lobbyist who's going to walk us through some of the specific proposals. Cheryl.
Hi, everyone. Cheryl Ed.D with the CSBA Legislative Advocate. Next slide. We're going to talk about all of the May revision proposals. There's a lot of them, so bear with us between Erika and I and us going through them. The first one is transitional kindergarten. I'm sure that there's been a lot of conversation about this because this is adding effectively grade 14 to our K-12 system. And so we have a lot of questions, I'm sure, that are gonna pop up throughout these proposals, and we're still waiting to get all those answers because the trailer bill language has not been released yet. So just bear with us, and we'll get to as many of the details as we can. There's going to be a 3-year transition period beginning in 22-23, and we're going to ramp up for every 3 months per year. That's going to bring in about $900 million per year, and we're going to rebench for that. So this was a big proposal that we saw in the Assembly. Assemblymember McCarty has introduced this bill for the past couple years, and so it looks like this has been adopted in the May revision. And so a big part of us was always saying that we need to rebench to accommodate that because we did not have sufficient funding in Proposition 98 to just absorb that new ADA without an additional funds to be able to support those new students. In the first year, so for the budget year moving out, there's going to be $250 million for planning and implementation grants in order to build up infrastructure. You might recognize this proposal. This was a proposal back in the governor's budget that would have been incentive funds over a 3-year period to be able to try to get LEAs to include transitional kindergarten for their larger populations. Another piece of this proposal is that there's going to be a class size ratio reduction. So there's going to be $380 million in 22-23, and then increasing all the way up to $740 million in 24-25, because the class size ratios are going to be going from 1 to 24 currently down to 1 to 12, and with the hopes of providing at minimum 3 hours of instruction. One of the things that are not addressed in the proposal, and actually there was a reduction in the funding for school facilities for full day K, is how we're going to provide facilities for this. So to the extent that you don't have local bonds to be able to support this, that's why this is going to be part of a large part of our advocacy, because with this kind of introduction, as many of you know, Title V regulations require many different purposes for children serving at that age that our current facilities may not be able to accommodate, especially bringing on so many at one time. So that's one big piece. Another thing is that we're bringing in more students. We're going to need more funding for transportation, also not addressed in this proposal, but will be part of our advocacy. Next slide, please. So the next thing that we're seeing abundance of is expanded learning opportunities. One of the larger ones, it builds off of AB 86 that we saw just back in March that provided funds for concentration grants. This is going to be for funds specifically for concentration grant schools and elementary schools at that comprehensive before and after school programs, summer school enrichments and supports. This is going to have a 5-year rollout plan starting with $1 billion in the budget year and then increasing by $1 billion basically until 25-26 till we get to a $5 billion limit. So this is going to be for before and after school programs and summer school activities, with the idea that children in elementary school age children in high concentration grant areas don't have the same access to enrichment activities in some of the more affluent communities. So the administration is really trying to target these funds towards those to provide more balance is what it looks like. There's also $2.6 billion in one-time funding. There's about $2 billion in federal and $600 million in Proposition 98 to accelerate learning and what the governor has referred to as high-dose tutoring. So we're going to see that there. But one of the things that we should mention, though, too, is that this is not eligibility for folks who don't have high concentration, who don't receive concentration grants. So we're still going to get details on what the 5-year rollout plan looks like. It looks like those that are going to be in like the highest of the concentration grant elementary schools are the ones that are going to get the first years of rollouts, with the intent to get to all concentration grant schools, elementary schools moving forward. So if you're not a concentration grant school, this funding wouldn't apply to you. We understand that's problematic. So we're gonna definitely say something about that. Next slide, please. Speaking of concentration grants, these are also going to go up from 50% of your LCFF base grant to 65% of your LCFF base grant. This is going to be equal to about $1.1 billion in ongoing funding. LAs are going to be required to specify in their LCAPs what this extra 15% of funds is going to, with the intent to reduce the staff to student ratio. So it's not just for classified staff, the way that we saw in AB 86 would be for teachers, counselors, nurses, paraprofessionals, principals, just reducing that overall staff to student ratio. And so you would just have to make sure that you state your intent, and that is our understanding right now of how that funding should go out. Next slide, please. I'm sure many folks have been planning for this or are planning for this or have finalized plans for this, is how we address distance learning or a virtual option in the fall. As we know, vaccines are available right now from 12 up, but we're going to still have some younger students. So therefore, you might have some parents that aren't super comfortable with sending students back, or just maybe you have some students that are doing really well in this environment and might want to continue using this virtual option. And so there was a lot of concern that we should extend SB 98 to be able to do that. The governor was very clear that he was not going to do that. And so we saw this in the May revision, that there's not going to be an extension of SB 98, but there's going to be some changes to the current independent study program, which allows folks the flexibility to be able to implement a distance learning option to the extent that they want to do so. But there's going to be some changes. So what they're looking to do is to increase access for students for technology and connectivity. They're also going to want you to develop a framework and implement re-engagement strategies, and also track and record daily student participation and interaction with teachers. This sounds a lot like what we saw in SB 98, not the whole thing, but these were all, as I'm sure everyone recalls, big pieces of that bill. And so I don't know if there's a need to really reinvent the wheel, but it looks like that there's going to be some of the same in there. We're going to go ahead and take a look at that trailer language to make sure that it doesn't interfere with your existing plans. Next slide, please. So something new is that school nutrition is going to get a bump. I think this was something that we saw in governor's budget back in 2020, but it got pulled back, obviously, because of the pandemic. So it's returning, and we're going to see $150 million to increase the state reimbursement rate ongoing for the school nutrition program. That's going to equate to about 25 cents per meal. So that's always great. I know we have a lot of school meal debt, so hopefully this helps with some of that, given that you're not getting reimbursed for that right now. It's probably encroaching on your general fund. There's going to be $100 million in one-time Prop 98 for school kitchen infrastructure upgrades and then training for cafeteria staff. It's unclear how much that split's going to be right now. We have an existing program that's Prop 98 funded for school kitchen infrastructure. It's about $1 million a year. So obviously this is a large infusion in that, and then just don't know how much is going to be available for training for staff yet. But once we get those details, we're going to be sharing those with you. Another is $30 million in one-time general fund for the Farm to School initiative. It's my understanding that this is one of the first partners. Big interests, and so it's going to be general fund. It's not going to come out of 98, and this was again another proposal that was in the 2020 governor's budget that got ripped out. So we'll see that moving forward if it should stay there. Next slide, please. So back in governor's budget in January, we saw about $540 million between 8 different programs for both the pipeline for teachers and then also for training grants. The May revision is going to bump that up to about $3.3 billion over a 3 to 5 year period, depending on the program, of which many of them are for grants for teachers who commit to high need schools, and then also to attract teachers to high poverty schools. This is a significant amount of funding, and so we just want to point this out. I want to point this out. This is all one-time funding. The difference between that 540 and 3.3 billion could be equal to paying off the deferral. As Dennis mentioned earlier, I'm not saying that this should go away. I'm just not making a quality statement, just pointing out that there's a lot of one-time funding in here that could be otherwise used to pay off that deferral. So you could eliminate those debts that you have right now, or the state could eliminate those debts. Now I'm going to, our next slide, and I'm going to hand it off to Erika so she can tell you more about all the categoricals that are presented in May revision.
Good afternoon. Okay, well, this is categorical part 1 now. I'm categorical part 2. As you've probably gotten an idea throughout a lot of this, there's a real big thematic issue the governor has of providing additional funding for extended year programs to help students, to help schools, to try to address the equity gaps, and to provide some accelerated learning. If you could put the next slide up, please. And this is one of those programs that the governor is talking about, is expanding community schools and expanding and diversifying wraparound services for students. As you know, community schools, they blend various programs and funding sources to provide kind of like a one-stop shop for students and families of integrated services along with supportive instruction. And he's looking in his budget to expand that. In January, it was about $265 million he proposed to establish new community schools and to kind of expand some of the current ones we have. He's ramped it up now to $3 billion in one-time funding over a 3-year period to expand and especially to start up potentially up to 1,400 community schools throughout the state and throughout LEAs, trying to get to about 60% of the students. So I mean, he's looking a lot to really expand this. Don't necessarily have a lot of detail yet on how this would be, or how the funding would go out, what the full qualifications are. As trailer bill language comes out, we'll get a better idea of that. Part of the wraparound services that he's looking at is to provide an increase of up to $4 billion over a 5-year period. That's part of the theme. It's a lot of 5-year chunks here. To identify and treat and hopefully better organize the behavioral health programs to address student needs. This is part of his Children and Youth Behavioral Health Initiative, which I'll talk a little bit about a little bit later because it's going to be run through the Department of Healthcare Services, and it's also tied to the increases in Medi-Cal funding. He is also providing, because a lot of the funding he has is going out to school districts, to LEAs, in trying to address some of the specific student needs that county offices of education look at. The governor is proposing $30 million in one-time funds to address some of the specific needs of foster students, since most of our county offices deal a lot with the foster kids, but it's looking to provide better coordinated services and programs of direct services to those two foster students. The next slide, please. This is a new program. This is something that, if you listen to the governor's press release or press conference this morning, he feels very strongly about, that students, especially low-income students who don't have savings accounts, who don't come from families where college is kind of just, that's the given of what you're going to be doing next in your life after you finish high school. He strongly believes that savings accounts for students are important. So he is proposing in non-98 funds, so this is state general fund money outside of 98, $2 billion to create savings accounts for students in K-12 that basically start with seed money of $500, and these are for students, and they're basically your concentration grant students to a great extent, low-income students, English learners, and foster youth. There will also be a supplemental to that. Oh, and this would also include homeless students too. And then there would be an additional supplemental to that if you're a foster kid or a homeless student. So there's potential, this account just as starting could be $1,000 to $1,500. So this is kind of, this kickstarts the program for this first year, and then there would be about $170 million proposed ongoing non-Prop 98 for annual funding for every first grader coming into school every year who fits this criteria. So it's one way to acknowledge and to, as he said, to start that thinking process that the kids have got basically some skin in the game of funding at least part of their higher education. This will be run through the Scholar Share program that currently runs the 529 accounts, but this would be separate and different from the 529 accounts that I know most of you are familiar with. Next slide, please. Special education. Yay, combined COLA. Huge thing for special ed. It's about $117 million to take the special ed COLA from the 1.5 that was proposed in January up to the 4.5. This gets in to be part of your permanent funding for special ed. So this is a wonderful, wonderful news when we heard this today. So we're very happy about that. The governor is also providing some very specific one-time resource money from one-time federal IDEA funds, and also through some of the American Rescue Plan funding, basically to increase some of the special education resources that are needed, especially as we bring students back, and the fact that we're going to be looking at compensatory ed and providing increased services, and especially looking at how do you redo IEPs for this year as we bring students back in the fall. So he's trying to help school district be able to cover some of those one-time costs to make sure that we can get kids back in and get them rolling again with their IEPs and getting all the supports that they need, including instructional aids, things like that. And then the governor is also providing some technical assistance to further develop and kind of looking at how can we do better IEPs, comprehensive IEPs, and providing additional services to students impacted by COVID. The concern with this, as with some of this other money, that's not just special ed, but through a lot of the other programs, is that these are all one-time funds for potentially services and functions that we'll need to continue for students. So that is something school districts will have to consider. As Cheryl mentioned earlier, we haven't seen trailer bill language on this. Not quite sure How this is going to be distributed. One concern I do have is if any of this is made into grant funding where you'd have to, apply for it. Every school district is going to be hit with additional special ed costs, and we need to make sure we can put that money out in an equitable enough manner across the spectrum so that all special education students get the assistance they need. The next slide, please. Mental health, behavioral health. The governor over the last year or so has had a very big focus on behavioral health and the impact on students, both from, excuse me, the issues of over the last number of years, the increased number of suicides of students. You layer COVID on top of that, the impact that has had on kids and how they feel about themselves and how they feel about the world around them. He has put together what he's calling the Children and Youth Behavioral Health Initiative. This component is one component of a much larger program that he's looking at that involves Medi-Cal funding, that involves behavioral health and trying to expand through Medi-Cal funding to education. But this one specifically is $400 million. He's was in January, it's now $1 billion for this initiative, and to basically do better connections between, let's say, county behavioral health and schools. And how can we get those, the services and the funding from county behavioral health into schools so that schools can then provide services? How do you, for a lot of districts, if you're looking at Medi-Cal issues, Medi-Cal managed, or the managed care plans under Medi-Cal, getting schools and Medi-Cal managed care plans together, because they're actually paid. The managed care plans are paid for a lot of the services that schools are kind of providing to these kids. We should be getting paid for that. So it's trying to address those issues and get that infrastructure pulled together. And then basically we also want to make sure, and part of this is the larger breadth of making sure that students are connected to services, be they through the school district, the county, the local managed care, even through private insurance too, for substance abuse, trauma, grief, mental health needs, and ultimately the physical health needs of students. It's going to be a very large issue. The state's Medi-Cal plan and health plan has now been expanded to basically healthcare for all. And which means every kid, not just a special education student, but every child in a school who qualifies for Medi-Cal can and is able to get health services. And so I think a lot of folks are going to be looking at schools to provide that. And what this funding is going to try to do is, at least to start with in this first year, is to try to hook up the infrastructure so that we can make sure these services all flow to kids. There's going to be a lot more detail on this coming out, trailer bill language and it's not going to be in the education side, it'll be in the health side of the budget. So I get to go read about all that very shortly. But we will have more details as more information comes out about what these programs look like, what the legislation is going to look like. They've been very close vested on what this program is going to look like. So it's raising some concerns, especially in making sure that schools are at the table when it comes to talking health issues for kids. Next slide, please. Broadband. This is absolutely the biggest shock, I think, for a number of us today, was that the governor actually put in $7 billion to cover the last pieces that are needed to ensure that we can connect students to the internet, and families and communities and even schools and libraries. But basically he's proposing $7 billion over 3 years for the Broadband for All initiative. And what he's trying to do with this funding is to literally address the digital divide. It's going to be used to close the middle mile. It's that connection between this provider and that provider, and then there's all the stuff in between. Support to close the last mile. I mean, that's where you've got the connections are out in the community, but through economics or the final connector pieces, families aren't able to access the internet, or at least access it at a rate they can afford. So trying to address those issues. One thing that he has proposed in this, and I'm still waiting to see the language on this, would be to allow local governments and tribes the opportunities to be the provider of services, to be the IFP, which is, basically you're kind of the utility type. When we've had school districts already who have built their own towers and are providing internet services within their communities, this is actually going to better allow that for local governments and for tribes on tribal lands, that maybe we don't have to park school buses with Wi-Fi hookups in them, and be able to get that finally built and connected. And then finally, one of the last issues is try to just make broadband more accessible to all. There are a number of proposals before the legislature that CSBA is supporting and working on that would kind of address all of these issues. And the governor was very broad in his description this morning by mentioning most of the authors. You've got Senator Lena Gonzalez, Senator Aguiar Curry, who've got some very large bills dealing with the middle mile, the last mile, and there's a whole variety of bills that we're going to address this. So this was, I think, at least to me, it was a nice surprise in the funding. And the next slide, we're going to give it back to Dennis and Cheryl to talk about what the remaining issues are.
So you've heard about all of the brand new programs or expansions of programs, but I think you kind of alluded that we still have some unresolved issues. One of the major ones, obviously, being that the deferral has not been entirely paid off. We still have a $2.6 billion balance in deferrals, while there's all of this one-time funding, record levels of one-time funding that are going to create brand new categorical programs. And so we really want to highlight that. That's obviously going to be a big part of our advocacy. We shouldn't be charging things on a credit card when we have plenty of cash to pay it off and buying something new. So that will be a big part. Another thing that kind of crept up on us that we didn't expect was that the unemployment insurance rate climbed from 0.5% to 1.23% in our unemployment fund, our school's unemployment fund. This raises up to $600 million increase, and it's not covered by the state. Obviously, that's going to be a really big concern for us, and we're going to make sure that we advocate for that. Despite how much money we're seeing in this, it doesn't hit everybody evenly, but something like this is going to be huge for everyone, and so we really just have to make sure that we don't take the eye off of that one. Another thing is excess ERAF. I know that Dennis talked about this a little bit. I know it's a little bit of a wonky term, but basically there were instructions from the controller's office that we're supposed to include a calculation of charter ADA. Regardless about how you feel about charter schools, they're students too. I think we can both agree on that. But there's 5 counties right now that are not including that ADA, and as a result, we're seeing reductions in total overall Proposition 98, anywhere from $300 to $500 million ongoing. That's huge. That's that 1% of the COLA that we saw right there. So this is going to equate anywhere from $60 to $80 per student in California, statewide. Even the 5 just the 5 counties. Now, if we see, and we've seen huge increases in property taxes, huge. I'm sure all of you guys are looking at housing prices right now and notice how substantial it is. When those property taxes go up, excess ERAF goes up too. But because of this calculation, we aren't going to see all of those dollars that would normally go to schools. And so I'll kick it over to Dennis to talk a little bit more about how we're working on this issue.
Thanks, Cheryl. As you start talking about this, Cheryl, we've identified all these different programs, and on this page here, we talk about unresolved issues. I mean, there are lots of little and big things within those programs we would need to figure out as well, but these are issues that are clearly not addressed that we want to make sure are part of the final budget. So on this ERAF issue, as Cheryl was talking about, there's 2 strategies here. One is the political legislative strategy, which is pointing this out, getting legislators to, address this issue in the final budget. And, that's our work. That's your work as local school board members and administrators. But assuming that does not take place, we're also working on a legal challenge as well, because there clearly is a mistake made in this guidance coming from the Controller's Office that is counter to what is actually in the current budget and in current law. So stay tuned on that, but we should all be talking about the fact that this is costing you as educators $50, $60 per ADA for money that's going to county governments just in a couple of counties, as Cheryl and I think Vernon mentioned this too. Other issues is those of you that, the ADA harmless, we didn't really hold harmless, we didn't really talk about here. So in the current year, there is the ADA hold harmless where you can't drop below your February of last year ADA. That will go away. And then you just rely then on the declining enrollment adjustment. So you kind of get one more year of a soft landing just because now you will be under the current statutes on declining enrollment. But there are several of you who are growing in the current year, and you're not allowed to realize that growing ADA. Some of you are just selling more houses because of development, or you're actually bringing kids back in from private schools or charter schools. But you're capped at your enrollment growth. And so, that's an issue that we're hearing from several of you as well, and that's not addressed, although there is money to address those currently growing districts. Pension costs. So as you know, the current year and the next year, there are protections in place to cover the increased costs as employers that you're facing for PERS and STIRS, but there's no plan beyond that. So, you're covered through this next budget year, but in 2022, 2023, we have our work to do to make sure that we're protected from that sudden impact of maybe that protection going away. So all of a sudden there's 2, 3, 4 point difference in contributions, and those are things that are not addressed here. It's not addressed verbally, and it's specifically not addressed as money being set aside. So we have a challenge there. And then again, we just, also just this loss of the supplemental payments, that is a promise that is in statute right now. And it's something that we're going to be bringing up as an education community, because, no matter how good this budget is, we are still woefully underfunded in California. So per pupil funding is how we compete with other states. That's an issue that we're going to still have to address. And we're hopeful that the supplemental payments would slowly get us there in a few years, but with that potentially being gone, there's obviously a concern there. So obviously a lot to advocate on this budget between now and when the budget is put to rest. But right now, let's turn this over to Mike Fine. He's the CEO of FCMAT, who will talk to us about some of the budget concerns that you all need to be looking for. Mike, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Dennis. Thanks for having me. I want to start out by reminding you a little bit about both Troy and Vernon's opening comments, and that is, while this is a very positive budget, especially given what we knew 6 months ago and what we knew a year ago, very, very positive, there are still many underlying concerns. And Dennis and Cheryl and Erika have outlined some of those concerns for you, but I want to really highlight the point that some of the concerns relate to the fiscal stability of your school districts. Next slide, please. And so as you, as trustees, in the coming weeks, you're going to be considering adopting budget that your staff brings to you. I think a couple reminders, or one particular reminder. Many of the new programs that Cheryl and Erika outlined here today won't be in those draft budgets that are brought to you here in the late May and June time periods, simply because your districts won't include them because these are still proposals until we have a final budget deal in mid-June. So remember the cautions and the information that you heard tonight. You'll be seeing those when you consider your 45-day revisions by mid-August, or even as late as first interim report revisions to your budget in the fall into December. And so the timing of when your district recognizes the final version of the new programs that the state adopts in their enacted budget will be important. But to the point that's been raised, and that is that we have a very large amount of one-time funds in this proposal, especially when you consider that we're already dealing with large amount of one-time state and federal funds as a result of COVID-19 relief. And so I encourage you as trustees to ask your staff as they bring the proposal for your budget forward. Remember that one of the most important pieces of that budget proposal will be a multi-year financial plan next year and the subsequent 2 years, a minimum of 3 years. It is during that period of time that many of the one-time programs will cease to exist. And so I encourage you to have 2 versions of that MYP, one that you consider that is reflective of all of your current conditions, including all the one-time resources. That's the one you would adopt to submit to your county superintendent for review. But to actually look and discuss a second version of the multi-year financial plan, and that would be one that takes all the one-time items out of your budget. And you're only looking at those recurring revenue and expenditure considerations. That's your structural condition. And the reason I highlight this is I want you as trustees in your role as first and foremost defense on fiscal stability matters in your district, for you to keep an eye on the ball. And that ball I'm really referring to are those out year issues of fiscal stability. All these one-time resources and one-time proposals will mask what is going on, truly going on in the structural foundational issues of your revenue and expenditure budget. And so you need to pay attention to the long term. As Dennis just alluded to, we have a financial cliff that's forecasted in 22-23, the result of the ADA hold harmless catch up, and for 60-some% of all of you, your districts are experiencing declining enrollment. In addition, the employer contributions to both CalSTRS and CalPERS will return to the pre-pandemic provisions. So the temporary relief that Dennis just described as a remaining issue would expire. These 2 items for most of you would be significant. Revenue reduction in the one case and expenditure increase in the other case. They will be partially offset in 22-23 based on the estimates from the GAN limit $8.1 billion estimate to be funded in 22-23 that Dennis outlined earlier this evening. So there'll be some offset, but the long-term impact, not the short-term or one-time impact, the long-term impact for your districts is one of declining enrollment and higher pension costs. Next slide, please. Your staff is very familiar, your fiscal staff is very familiar with kind of some general rules of thumb on budget basics, but I thought tonight would be a great opportunity to review that with you as trustees and remind you of this. First and foremost, budgets should be driven by a plan. You don't start with the budget, you start with the plan. And the plan in our world is a plan that's built around the ideas of student achievement, both student academic achievement and student personal achievement, and social and emotional support or stability. And most of you know that as your local control and accountability plan, but there are other plans that you as a district adopt. Some of you also adopt a strategic plan that goes beyond the LCAP. Some of you have facility master plans where you want to improve facilities and add facilities in alignment with the direction that you're going instructionally. So consider all your plans. That's what drives your budget. There's no accident that when Jerry Brown brought us the local control funding formula, that there's a requirement that you first adopt an LCAP and then you adopt a budget that's aligned to the LCAP. Just remind you of that very basic concept. The second thing I want to remind you of is that you have to look at all funds, all sources and resources in developing your financial plan that supports your LCAP and those other plans. And what I mean by this is think about your budget as a puzzle, and the beautiful picture of your district and the services that you're delivering to students are reflected in that picture of the puzzle. The puzzle is made up of lots of puzzle pieces. You need to ensure that you're accounting for all of the puzzle pieces. Your unrestricted general fund, your Title I, your one-time funds, your facility funds, all of those funding resources are puzzle pieces to that beautiful picture. The third concept here is you use your most restricted funds first. And I also want to remind you that restrictions on funds come in a variety of flavors. They may be restricted to eligible uses, what you can use these funds for, eligible targeted students that you can use them from, or time. And I'll remind you all of a great example of this. For most of you, federal Title I funds are your historically most restricted funds. This year, though, we have waivers in place that allow carryover of those Title I funds. So, and we have a lot of one-time federal resources that can be used for the same purposes and broader purposes. And so the question is, what are the expenditure deadlines for some of these one-time and unique funds that we've received this year and will receive next year? And do those timelines basically create deeper restrictions than the eligible use restrictions in Title I? So keep your eye on that. But generally speaking, if you're going to have money left over, you want to have the money that is the most unrestricted left over at the end of the day. And my last comment, and this is absolutely critical that you keep this in mind, and this is your most significant challenge, I believe, this year, next year, and for the next several years to come, and that is using one-time funds on one-time needs. The problem that we have is we don't have alignment between needs and recurring funding. Our students have tremendous needs. They had tremendous needs before the pandemic. They have even more needs subsequent to the pandemic. And yet many of the resources that we're getting to meet those pandemic-related needs are one time, but the students' needs are ongoing. And so how you balance that becomes critically important. The governor's proposal is very heavy on one-time resources, although out over several years. So one-time spread, not just 1 year, but spread over 2 or 3 years. You've got to think about, though, what you're putting in place in that first year and that second year and that third year, and do you have the ability to sustain that when those one-time resources expire in the 4th year or the 5th year, as an example. The other thing to think about with one-time is how do you invest those one-time resources that not only produce savings, but produce systematic structural changes in your district to position you to better serve students, both academically and social and emotional, and their social and emotional needs. And with that, next slide, I'd like to introduce Mr. Brett McFadden, Superintendent of Nevada Joint Union High School District, to give you some perspectives.
Thanks, Mike, and members of the panel. Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here. My name is Brett McFadden. I've had the great honor for the last 3 years to be the superintendent of the Nevada Joint Union High School District. And give a shout out, I've seen some of my friends in Southern California. So to our Southern California folks, if you ever have the chance to go north of Magic Mountain, you'll discover a whole other state up here. So come up and visit us sometime. My district is about an hour northeast of Sacramento, about 19 miles north of Auburn. We're in the communities of Grass Valley and Nevada Cities. We're a foothill Sierra district. Most of my district is rural. We're a high school district, and we have 8 feeder districts that feed into us, servicing grades 9 through 12, as well as an adult education program. So my perspective today comes from sort of 2 different perspectives. The bulk of my career has been as a former chief business officer in 2 other districts, and those were in urban areas with high EL populations, high percentages of students with low socioeconomic, coming from low socioeconomic statuses and such. But secondarily, my perspective is matched with that of being a superintendent and instructional viewpoint. But representing that of small rural districts, which is about, well over 55% of school districts in terms of total number of school districts in the state. And so with those little perspectives in mind, I would sum up sort of my 2 cents on this May revised proposal in one simple statement. And that is, I believe that this is a historic opportunity missed. It's a historic opportunity missed. As many of the other panelists referenced, we're having just a historic amounts of one-time dollars coming to us from the federal government, state government, to be in response to the pandemic, as well as we're seeing rapidly growing Proposition 98 figures. While I want to congratulate the governor and his administration for looking at the various social, emotional, equity, and academic and early learning barriers to learning for our students, and those are noble, certainly. If you look at each of the individual proposals by themselves, sort of in a silo, each and every one of them has an importance, and they are critical public policy issues, and they are noble. However, as Dennis Meyers alluded to earlier in the presentation, is we as a whole, no matter what district you're from, we continue to be challenged by a woefully underfunded system. And we have these basic challenges that have been pressed against us for the better part of 20 years that the state has continually not been able to or unwilling to address. And you've heard some of the unresolved issues about pensions, declining enrollment, any host of other issues that are out there that we need to address. And while we look at this proposal in detail, you'll see that the bulk of the new funding is being obligated to a set of new categorical programs. And so I have a second, sort of fundamental question is whatever happened to local control? I would argue that since 2013, when Governor Brown put in the local control funding formula and the local control accountability plan format, I would argue that the majority of school districts around the state made their greatest gains when it came to addressing academic needs and social emotional needs and equity needs of their students, because it was left to us to be able to decide. I would much rather see a system that is holding us accountable but let us work within our systems and address the unique needs of our community and the unique needs of our students. I'm going to take a guess that there could be 45% of school districts, the majority of them small rural districts, that will not see their proportionate share out of this May revise. They will still be saddled with the issues of declining enrollment and not being able to take advantage of a lot of this new funding, at least on a proportionate share. They may not even be able to have the local capacity in order to fully participate in many of these programs. And so what concerns me is that where we had an opportunity to address issues that we're all facing across the spectrum, and when address that in a systems approach, and Michael Follen, an education researcher and such, talks about a systems approach to take in this, where we have that opportunity, I think that this proposal perhaps is more aligned to issues that make great sound bites and are politically expedient. And I know that may sound a bit harsh, but we have a real opportunity here if we, as collectively as an education community, can push back and get some response from the legislature, that we can instead use these dollars, as Mike Fine said, in order to leverage long-term sustained change and fundamentally change the trajectory of our agencies and how we serve our unique community and our individual needs overall. And so that would be that's my initial 2 cents to the budget and the budget proposal overall. And I want to transition now, and it gives me great honor to introduce a good friend of mine and a great education leader in the East Bay area, Dr. Daryl Camp.
Gosh, thank you, Brett, and thank you for the CSBA for the opportunity to share as well. Thanks to CSBA for selecting 2 superintendents. I guess this year there was a under 5'4" requirement in order to join the webinar. So Brett and I are saying we see eye to eye on many issues. So my perspective as an urban school district superintendent, just one in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, we have about 9,400 students, K through 12, about 70% free and reduced lunch, 25% emerging bilingual students. And overall, I would have to, I have a positive reaction to the budget, especially when I look at it from a long-term basis. I remember when I became a superintendent in 2012, I think the Prop 98 guarantee was somewhere in the 40-something million. So the fact that we're talking about the numbers that we're talking about in terms of allocations to K through 14 education right now, it's a tremendous difference from what I experienced at first. And it also tells me, it's interesting. I remember in January of 2020, we were still talking about the expansion of the California economy, the longest expansion in the history, right? That was our conversation. And then we had the pandemic-induced recession. So, and then it seems like things were falling apart very rapidly, and we were all struggling at the May revision last year. And then to look at where we are today makes me say, boy, I guess our top 1% of wage earners in California are really doing well, and that's what this means. So I'm happy that they're doing well, and I'm happy that there's more money to invest. But I am cautious, like many of the other panelists, saying, boy, a lot of these are one-time dollars, and it's going to mask a situation that's structurally out of balance. For districts like mine, and I hear about 60% of the school districts in California had declining enrollment before the pandemic, this really puts the community in a difficult sort of schizophrenic mindset. Do we have a budget crisis or don't we? And messaging has been extremely and will be extremely difficult, saying, yes, we have a structural imbalance in terms of our ongoing dollars, unrestricted. We are spending more than we receive, and it's being masked by these one-time dollars. But that's a hard message to deliver to a community. There's some other factors that I think we need to consider. I know I'm considering all of the points mentioned by McFadden and FCMAT. They do a great job. How are we going to use one-time dollars to make investments into our overall operations? Some ideas we would love to see from a statewide perspective is to pay down some of the liabilities associated with CalSTRS and our pension systems. Obviously, the unemployment, we would like to see that get paid down. That would help us out tremendously. Locally, we could make a decision to invest in our other post-employment benefits, and that would help us out for a period of time if we made some investments in OPEB. Of course, there'll be other demands on that money, particularly from our professional associations, some trade unions, and I understand it's hard to live in the Bay Area, and every additional dollars would help. The other part that I don't think has been realized, it was touched on, I think, by Cheryl, was that TK, the expansion of TK is, it sounds good, although it will leave some school districts in a difficult position of, one, finding teachers, and then two, how are you going to house more students for some? So that will, we might be able to figure it out in San Lorenzo because we have declining enrollment, but I'm not sure if the proportion of new students will mitigate the declining enrollment, if you know what I mean. It's sort of a balance. The last thing I just want to mention is we're trying to figure out what's happening with enrollment. We once again are one of those 60% of the districts that have declining enrollment. And this year, like many of us, we had lower kindergarten and TK enrollment than what we were expecting. So we don't really know what's happening with TK and K, and that's going to happen. That we're going to find out more this year coming up in 21, 22, and beyond. The other factor that I don't know is fully being realized or considered is the potentiality for a dramatic enrollment shift because of housing pattern changes that may be induced because of the pandemic. A lot of people can perform their job in Sacramento or Stanislaus County, or they can perform their Silicon Valley job in a number of counties from around the state or nation. So what is that doing in terms of housing patterns and where families decide to move? The main thing, like I said in closing, is just that I think it is an opportunity. I think every district's going to have to really evaluate their priorities, and I'm encouraging our district to form a spending plan for ongoing dollars and a reduction plan for ongoing dollars. And then I think you have to have a companion plan based on your priorities and goals as a district on what would you do with one-time dollars if you have those. There should be a spending plan that's aligned to district goals, mission, vision, and values and priorities based on one-time and ongoing dollars. So those are some of my initial takes on this budget. Overall positive, although it does present some challenges and will continue to present some challenges. With that, thank you again, CSBA, and turn it back to Troy.
Thank you, Dr. Camp, and thank you to all of our panelists for digging through this wealth of information. I know it's a lot to break down in a relatively short amount of time, and I think you did an excellent job. We have a number of questions. We won't get to all of them, but we're going to get to as many as we can, so we'll jump right in. I'll stick with the superintendents for this first question here because it pertains to the LCAP, which is really in your wheelhouse. And the question is, how can schools best use this funding? And with regards to funding in the LCAP, what is the role of the superintendent in helping direct those funds to the best place?
Yeah, I know locally in my system, we're having a lot of conversation about defining what are our core services and then deciding what services are above and beyond to supplement and support our core services. In other words, we're having a lot of time defining the original intent of the supplemental and concentration dollars. The original intent was to improve or increase services for students, but that's a difficult conversation also when you're dealing with declining enrollment, because the conversation we were having in 2013, 14, and 15 is very much different than now when you're actually talking about a decrease in supplemental and concentration dollars because of the decrease in enrollment. So now we have to look at the COLA increasing, the enrollment decreasing, and what does that mean in terms of programs and services and the people that provide those for our students. That's our conversation locally. Oh, Brett, you're on mute.
All right, there. Sorry, you'd think I would know that after a year and a half to unmute myself. Try to follow up with what Daryl mentioned. Daryl's right. I think the superintendent is sets the tone and the direction for these discussions. A mentor of mine once said that the core role of the superintendent is to sort of set the table for great learning and instruction. And so really setting that condition to be able to have these dialogues. And so I think you start from the premise, superintendents, I would recommend that you start with the premise of, all right, what is your immediate and long-term needs as it relates to student achievement and student well-being? And I would definitely combine both of those two. I think gone are the days where we're looking at academic achievement and then social emotional well-being and equity issues separately. They go hand in hand, and when you're addressing them equally, you will have substantial outcomes, student outcomes, sustained student outcomes for that. So you then, secondarily, you then look at what your conditions that you're under. And as Daryl mentioned, if you're facing declining enrollment, what impact is that having on your overall funding or other conditions you're facing? And then finally, I guess what I would say is if you've done a great job of building your team and your cabinet and your leaders and such, is lay that out, lay that discussion out, set the table for that, and then get out of the way. Let your staff be able to do their thing, and definitely be listening to and be cognizant with your stakeholders, your teachers, classified staff, students, and parents and community.
Thank you. We also have a question from a growth district, and they're wondering how the budget is dealing with addressing the issue of unfunded growth.
Well, it's one of the issues that needs to be addressed. It was one of the things we talked about. So we know how the hold harmless works, and in the adopted budget, there is a limit in the current year to how much you can grow, and that limit is based on did you budget for it. So many of you know that when you do see growth coming, and let's say it's 2%. Typically, you're not going to budget for that 2%. So you may say, all right, we feel comfortable maybe with 1%, and then we'll adjust after September when we know what the real number is. That's not allowed under the current budget. What we're saying is, wow, with this extra money, it'd be nice if you did fix that in the current year. So rolling forward, then growth will be allowed in this next budget if you do have enrollment growth. So right now, it's really an issue in the current year because some of you have grown. Some of you have grown by 5%. Not a lot of you, but some have. And so that's an issue that is not addressed in the May revision, and is something that we have to be pushed for. But I'm just going to say it's going to take a major effort to get that addressed in the current year for the current budget. Otherwise, it starts going back to normal after the current year.
And I would add to that, Troy, I don't have any expectation it will be addressed for the current year. We did that in SB 820 over the summer to the extent that there was willingness to do it. I don't see that being expanded. I will tell you that in regular conversations with Department of Finance and CDE on how we expect to treat next year is that for those districts that were granted growth funding this year, that will become their prior year safe haven or their prior year hold harmless. It won't go back to 1920 for those, and we call that proxy ADA, proxy for 2021 basically. So for districts that are declining, the prior year will go all the way back to 1920. For districts that are growing, the intent is to use that growth ADA that was recognized this year in 2021 as the prior year.
Thanks, Mike. That piece answered a number of other questions that people had. So thanks for anticipating that. It wouldn't be a CSBA webinar if we didn't have several questions about basic aid districts. So I'm wondering if somebody can distinguish between how this proposal would likely impact your traditional state-funded districts or that are more heavily state-funded and the basic aid districts.
I can take a crack at that because I saw the questions generating. Basic aid districts in this budget, not a lot for you. The COLA for special education does apply. That's good. LCFF COLA, being 5%, a double COLA. If you are barely basic aid, maybe you might go back into an LCFF district, but it really depends on your local situation. And we call those kind of toe in, toe out basic aid districts. So maybe that might mean you go back into LCFF. And then obviously the rest of these programs that we talked about, depending if they are LCFF or concentration grant kinds of programs, you're not going to play in those. But if they are other grant programs for some of the teacher development that are grant programs, you just need to kind of look at the rules. And so as we were preparing for this about an hour before the trailer bill language came out, so we haven't been able to read that yet. So more of that is coming. But yeah, I mean, it's not something that basic aid districts are going to be playing a lot in this budget. So, pay attention more about how some of these smaller programs might work for you.
Thanks, Dennis. We had a number of questions about the TK provisions and how those are going to be implemented, what the timeline is. I know you went over that, Cheryl, but if you could just give a real quick refresher. Some people who are watching this are concerned that they're going to have to scramble for this next year, and I just want to clarify that.
Well, their concerns are probably warranted. I mean, you have 1 year to plan, and then if the proposal were to go through as is currently drafted, 22-23 would be the first year to start that additional 3 months for TK rollout. I saw some other questions in here, so I can probably just bring them up related to TK. Again, for basic aids, this is probably going to be a concern because TK is going to be funded through LCFF. So to the extent that you don't receive LCFF, you wouldn't see those additional dollars for TK. Another question for TK, I'm sorry, there's a bunch of them popping up. Troy, did you have any other questions that you wanted to?
No, keep going. You're doing great.
There's other questions too about transportation. Also, again, you're going to be serving more students, and so that's going to be one of the things that we advocate for as well, because we haven't seen a COLA in transportation since LCFF was implemented back in 13-14, and my understanding even further back then. So will be a large concern. For facilities, just a reminder, we don't have any more state funding in the bond right now. So if you don't have any available bond funds to be able to convert your classroom, we really need to put a lot of pressure on the state to be able to pick up this tab, because there's not a state match to be able to make up for this funds. So that's something else to be aware of for TK. But yeah, there's a lot of concerns to get ramped up in just a year of this. So we'll continue to talk to us about it, and we're going to bring up your concerns moving forward as the May revision speed travels full steam ahead.
Thanks, Cheryl. We had a couple questions about mental health in terms of who will be administering the funds or managing them, and then also whether the state is going to commit to longer term funding of mental health and social and emotional learning. Do you have thoughts on that, Erika?
Yeah, a lot of the funding for these programs is probably going to end up going through the Department of State Department of Healthcare. And that's because they also oversee the Medi-Cal program, the local education agency billing option program, all of those things. So, and then you've also got, they also oversee behavioral health services. So odds are it's going through there. There will be input, and at least from discussions I've had with DHCS, that there is going to be collaboration with the Department of Education. But at this point, that's kind of just about what I know. I haven't seen the specific trailer bill language on it yet. One of the pieces I know that they're looking at doing with a lot of this money, especially funding that schools would have access to, is to help schools set up the infrastructure that they would need to provide these services. And then you could start billing Medi-Cal, start billing managed care plans under Medi-Cal, start billing private insurance even, which hopefully then would keep your programs operational and running. And it's a concern because for some districts, I'm not sure that they're going to have the student base to offset it. It's one of those issues over the next couple of weeks that we're going to have to start looking really closely at, and looking very, very closely at the trailer bill language, and most likely enabling legislation that frankly won't even get passed until August. So I think on some of the mental health stuff, we've got a long time to fight through some of these issues. And I do use that term fight because a lot of what we've asked for and a lot of the conversations we've had in the past is you've got healthcare folks making all these decisions for school folks, and they really haven't ever talked to the school folks. And then they kind of sit there and go, well, what do you mean it doesn't work in schools? We need to be at that table. And it's something that, I mean, personally, I've fought for over 15 years being at CSBA to get us there. They're finally starting to acknowledge that. And so hopefully we will be able to go to the table with them and get it worked out. As far as ongoing funding, that's going to be one of the fights I think we have in the future years.
Hey, Troy, let's go back, because on this LCFF issue, we've had, LCFF and TK and Basic Aid, because we've had some exchanges with Basic Aid districts over the last few weeks. The fear is, wow, I don't play in this LCFF, but am I going to be required to offer TK? And so, I think that might be part of what some of the questions from Basic Aid districts are. So as long as TK and kindergarten are not part of compulsory education, then it's not going to be a requirement. But we had a conversation earlier with our board of directors where the question was asked, and it's like, well, if you're a Basic Aid district surrounded by non-Basic Aid districts and they open up and start doing TK, then there's some pressure points there about whether or not you're going to be expected to politically. So, be thinking about that if you're a Basic Aid district. But right now, it's not required, and it doesn't seem like that is in the language. But again, we got to see the language. We just got it right before we went live, so we'll take a look at that.
Thanks, Dennis. Just want to reemphasize that a lot of this information you're being provided is based on the budget proposal. For many of these issues, the devil is in the details, so you'll want to actually go through the trailer bill language, which nobody has had a chance to do yet. So expect to see, more iterations and deeper interpretations of what's going to happen as people get a chance to go through that. We received a couple of questions about labor, specifically whether there are going to be any restrictions on the ability of LEAs to implement layoffs or otherwise by their workforce levels.
Wow. Not in the budget, but there is pending legislation that potentially that would do that. So AB 438 is one that I think it's AB 438 would grant the same layoff, March 15th layoff notice requirements for classified employees that are now there for certificated. And if that happens, then most of your budgets out there like 85–90% employees, and so 2 months before they make revision, 3 months before budget adoption, 6 months before your first correction, when you know exactly what your ADA is, you'd have to be, issuing these layoff notices. It's really a bad bill. There's also another bill, and I can't remember the number, but it would put the March 15th layoff notice and a 2-year probationary status for very small districts. Right now, I think districts under 250 ADA have a 3-year probationary period. So there's another bill that if this applies to you, just email us and we'll get you the bill number because I can't remember it right now. But I mean, those are 2 pending bills, but the biggest one is the one that impacts classified employees because that's, brand new and it just is nonsensical and it's something that just doesn't make sense, given all the budget constraints and time constraints that you have as governing boards and superintendents to work through your budget. So we have a lot of work to do on that one.
And Troy, I would add just on that same theme that many of the programs, many of the one-time, or as Cheryl indicates, the categorical programs that have been proposed actually have increased staffing directly tied to them in the very brief summary language without having read the trailer bill yet. So several of these programs are to add staff to campuses, to lower staffing ratios, to do a variety of things, not only for the regular instructional day, but even in the after school program. To add on to Dennis's comments about restrictions on layoffs, I would also point out that many of these funds are specific to adding staff.
Thank you for that. We had a couple, we're gonna go into the lightning round here and try and speed through a few more questions. A couple questions about CTE and then also a question about nutrition services. People are wondering how will the budget affect career technical education, if at all, and are there mandates related to nutrition services in the budget?
So for CTE, you're getting a COLA, the 1.7% COLA for this year. That was on one of the previous slides, but we didn't actually list it out. There's not a whole lot going on in CTE this year. The JPAs are getting some funding for their ROCP programs. So that's there. As far as it's a mandate, I hope not, but we don't know until we can see the language. I know that the way that, the Skinner bill reads right now, some people may be following this, it's SB 364. It does appear to be a mandate, and there's a lot of elements from that bill, which Skinner is the head of budget, so Senate budget. So, we see a lot of, sprinklings of her bill in here, but we aren't going to know exactly how that plays out until I can see some language. And then once we do, we'll of course update everybody. But I'm hoping that it's not.
Thanks, Cheryl. And then I know we touched on deferrals, but want to circle back because a number of people expressed concern that these deferrals may never be repaid. And so can someone speak to that?
We have similar concerns. I think that that's the reason why we've been pushing for this since fall, to make sure that these all got paid off, because we had an understanding there was going to be a large cash receipt in current year, and that got spent in AB 86. And now we see May revision with the remaining deferral, and what's going on? Why are we still seeing this when we have plenty of cash? Why are we creating brand new programs or expanding huge one-time programs when we should be paying off the credit card? And so again, this will be a huge part of our advocacy to make sure that we aren't implementing strategies that we would normally use in a time when we are down in the budget, down in the dumps. for things to just delay funding to schools so that we can start something brand new and shiny. That's not a good precedent to set, and that's not one that we're going to get behind.
Thank you, Cheryl. And we'll close with one final question that deals with messaging or a public relations issue. A number of people ask how with the COLA and all the news about the new programs that are being created, it creates the impression that school districts are flush with cash, which, as we know, is not true when you look at the underlying structural issues that aren't being addressed. So how, as a board member or a governance team member, would you tell your community that seeing these big numbers on the news, what the reality is and how that's a constraint on what you can do financially?
Brett?
Thanks. Throw me under the bus there. I think you just start from your standpoint of just your data and in showing your board, what you could expect to receive as well as the unknowns. I'm a firm advocate of, utilizing some type of study session that your board can have that's done in an open session, and you can sort of lay all of these arguments and these issues out. So there's not a lot of time, but this is where the superintendents and staff, you're going to be needing to very quickly utilize the resources of CSBA, AXA, and school services and such to get your board members the information that they need to know. I'm also a firm advocate of, give a board what they need to know, but be careful not to give them too much. I mean, you don't want to overwhelm them with incredible amounts of budget speak. So you want to be mindful of your audience and what it is they need to know in order to make decisions. Timing of this is very critical because all of us are, our next board meetings will be the public hearings for our LCAP and our budgets. And then shortly after that, we will vote on our LCAPs and budgets. And you haven't seen an LCAP in over a year. So not a lot of time to sort of educate your board on the true realities of how this budget proposal may or may not affect your individual district.
If I could just add on to that too, to get into Brett's budgety type of speaking, is that these are one-time funds. They're not going to everyone. Brett's a high school district, so a lot of these billions of dollars may not necessarily go towards him. If you're not a concentration grant district, it's not going to go towards you. And so while we see a lot of these brand new categoricals, that doesn't mean that everyone is getting them. It just means there's a lot of funds out there that are one-time in nature. And just because you create a community school doesn't mean that you have the ongoing funds presently to be able to maintain that community school. So we have to really look at it as a long-term thing. Do we really want to build something out that we don't have committed funding to move forward? So all of those types of things are the questions that we talk about up here in Sacramento, of that, like, yes, these are great, these are amazing, but we really need to make sure that we can make ends meet for the bottom line and not just build up things that are going to have to go away in a couple of years once that one-time funding runs out. And then that's to the extent that you got it in the first place.
Thanks, Cheryl. I think that's a good place to end. Before everyone goes, I know it's a Friday night, but there's actually another opportunity to dive even deeper into the budget. I know you guys haven't gotten your fill, so if you could advance a slide, we will talk about the budget perspective workshops, which are coming up. These are hosted by Capital Advisors and co-sponsored by CSBA and a number of other organizations within the education community. It's sort of a traveling roadshow, many meetings across. I think usually it's around 20 or so throughout the state. So there will be one somewhat near you, no matter where in California you are. There's a link down there at the bottom you can click on to learn more about the events and to see what the schedule is when we'll be coming to town near you. So that's a great place to get more information. We will also be sending you sometime tomorrow an email that has a link to the recording of today's webinar, as well as a link to the PowerPoint that our presenters used. So I hope you found this valuable. We will continue to be in conversation and provide you with updates